Hello everybody, today we'll be reacting to how to beat all Jigsaw traps. Let's see.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. By now we've looked at how to beat the first two Saw movies, so when I started watching Saw 3 I felt pretty confident. However, I quickly realized that not every trap here is beatable. Most of them are, but the first two either require specific knowledge that the people in the trap don't have, or you can only do so much to increase your odds of survival. And it's not because the traps are set up carefully and plan out well, but because they're completely rigged. The people in them weren't meant to survive at all. But let's get started and find out which traps you can beat. Saw 3 starts out pretty much exactly where Saw 2 left off. Eric Matthews is alone in a dark dungeon where Amanda left him to die. He realizes he's chained to a pipe by his ankle, similar to how the people in the first movie were. Then he notices the saw and gets that he's meant to cut off his own foot, but that's not really an option for him. Instead, he takes a nearby toilet tank lid and uses that to break his foot and pull it out of the shackles. He does manage to escape, but before smashing.
If you guys are wondering, I don't know how to turn off this setting. Well, it'll do it like this by itself, and I don't press nothing.
Your foot, there's something else you could do. In the beginning, he sees that Amanda left him a gun without any ammo, and what he could have tried is using the heavy, empty gun as a sort of hammer to break the lock chaining him to the pipe. The lock on his foot doesn't really look like one of those unbreakable heavy-duty locks, but much more like a smaller off-the-shelf lock that you can break by force alone, and it's certainly something you could try before smashing your own foot. We cut to a SWAT team arriving at the crime scene of yet another victim of the Jigsaw killer.
Oh my god. Someone call Carrie.
Allison, the cop from the last movie, is also here, and based on what they find, they get a good idea of what happened. A man named Troy was put in this classroom with multiple chains piercing his flesh and one through his jaw. Jigsaw explains that he was put here because he spent his entire life in and out of prison, so now he must fight for his freedom. On the table in front of him is a nail bomb with a 1-minute 35-second timer on it. In order to survive, Troy needs to rip out all the chains pierced through his body and escape the room. However, one thing he isn't told is that the trap is nearly impossible to beat. First of all, the door to the classroom was welded shut.
If the aim of Jigsaw's game was to get out before the bomb went off, then why was the door welded shut? The guy couldn't get out if he wanted to.
And one of the rings goes through his mouth. So to remove it, you'd have to pull out your entire jaw, which you can't do because you'd die of the blood loss. So survival is not only highly unlikely, but also virtually impossible. With that being said, there are things you could try to slightly improve your odds. You could remove all the rings from your upper body and reach left and right to get chairs and tables and throw it at the bomb. This might sound kind of strange, but what could happen is that the jar falls off the table and breaks, which means that the nails inside roll all over the place, and once the explosive goes off, fewer nails function as projectiles. You would also be covering the bomb with furniture. This adds resistance, which slows down the nails. Then if you ripped out all the 6 necessary chains, you could lie on the floor with your legs facing the bomb. That way you not only minimize the area where you could be hit, but you do the best you possibly can to protect your head. But again, survival is highly unlikely, because this trap wasn't meant to be beaten in any way. Troy ends up removing all the chains except for the one in his jaw, but the bomb goes off and tears him to shreds. We cut to Allison's home during the evening. She watches the Jigsaw tape retrieved at the crime scene, but it switches to a different video. It shows security camera footage of her apartment, and it's a live feed. She tries looking for the camera, but gets kidnapped by someone. A few hours later, she wakes up chained to a device while hanging off the floor. The TV in the room turns on and reveals that she's here because as a police officer, she dedicates her life to protecting society from deranged serial killers, which in Jigsaw's eyes means that she's not appreciating life? I mean, she's probably just here because John needs to get rid of her. Here, Allison has 1 minute to retrieve the key to the trap from a beaker full of highly corrosive acid. After struggling to free herself, she reaches into the beaker and actually manages to get the key. But even though she played by the rules, the lock doesn't open. Then someone comes in, struggling to free herself, she reaches that she's not appreciating life? I mean, she's probably just here because John needs to get rid of her. Here, Allison has 1 minute to retrieve the key to the trap from a beaker full of highly corrosive acid. After struggling to free herself, she reaches into the beaker and actually manages to get the key. But even though she played by the rules, the lock doesn't open. Then someone comes in and remotely sets off the trap. meaning that this one was also rigged. Now let's here Allison has 1 minute to retrieve the key to the camera but gets kidnapped by someone. A few hours later, she wakes up chained to a device while hanging off the floor. The TV in the room turns on and reveals that she's here because as a police officer, she dedicates her life to protecting society from deranged serial killers, which in Jigsaw's eyes means that she's not appreciating life? I mean, she's probably just here because John needs to get rid of her. Here Allison has 1 minute to retrieve the key to the trap from a beaker full of highly corrosive acid. After struggling to free herself, she reaches into the beaker and actually manages to get the key. But even though she played by the rules, the lock doesn't open. Then someone comes in and remotely sets off the trap, meaning that this one was also rigged. Now let's assume that it was. Here Allison has 1 minute to retrieve the key to the trap from a beaker full of highly corrosive acid. After struggling to free herself, she reaches into the beaker and actually manages to get the key. But even though she played by the rules, the lock doesn't open. Then someone comes in and remotely sets off the trap, meaning that this one was also rigged. Now let's assume that it wasn't actually fixed and the key really would free you. What you can do in that situation is pour the acid out of the beaker. And since your legs are off the floor, it's not like you're letting the acid run onto your feet. The beaker is also hanging from chains instead of being fixed in place, so you can lift it up, pour the acid out, and then get the key with only minimal acid burns. However, the trap was rigged, and I think there is a way you can theoretically stop the machine from tearing you apart. Still, it requires you to know how the trap is set up, which Allison doesn't know. But if you ever find yourself in this exact setup, you might beat it. So the beaker is most likely filled with nitric acid. I'm not a professional chemist, but from my research, the only acid to have this yellow tint is nitric acid if you expose it to air for some time. Nitric acid, by the way, is strong enough to dissolve a lot of metals. Anyways, the way this trap works is that these small wires pull at the bars connected to your ribs and tear them away. So you could try spilling the acid onto the thin wires by rocking the beaker towards them. If they're made out of steel or even platinum, the acid will eat through the iron in the cables and significantly weaken the other metals to break in time. Since the acid is powerful enough to dissolve this key in a matter of seconds, it could do the same to the wire. That way, once the person comes in and activates the trap, the wires would break and not pull anything away from your body. But the killer is still in the room and is probably wondering why the trap didn't fling your body in half. From there on your own, because I'm all out of ideas. Soon after, a doctor named Lynn Denlin gets kidnapped and brought.
I watched all the songs, and I do not remember this trap being in that. I do not remember that. Oh my god. Jigsaw. What you need to do. If I was Jigsaw, every movie I would say, to get out this trap, you must do something with your life. And if you get out the trap, then I will let you go and I will let you redeem yourself. But if you do something bad again, I will have you back at that place with an impossible trap that you cannot beat. Just like that rib breaker one. Unless you know the method to do it like that. Yeah.
Into Jigsaw's lair. We see that Amanda kidnapped her. She brings Lynn to a room with John Kramer where she's supposed to treat his brain tumor. But it's not that simple because even this is turned into a trap. Lynn gets a device called a shotgun collar strapped around her neck which is linked to John's heart rate.
The second that heart rate monitor flatline.
I'm all out of ideas.
He has brain cancer still? I didn't know he had brain cancer in those movies too. I forgot about that.
Soon after, a doctor named Lynn weakened the other metals to break in time. It would break and not pull anything. Jigsaw's lair. We see that Amanda kidnapped her. She brings Lynn to a room with John Kramer where she's supposed to treat his brain tumor. But it's not that simple because even this is turned into a trap. Lynn gets a device called a shotgun collar strapped around her neck which is linked to John's heart rate.
The second that heart rate monitor flatlines, or you move out of range, an explosion will go off in that collar.
The shotgun collar is beatable because it has a few significant weak points which you can exploit, but we'll get back to this one later, because it becomes much more important at the end of the film. Now we see a man named Jeff waking up.
Hold up. Oh.
Jeff waking up in a box which sits on top of a.
End this video real quick. I'll be right back, guys. Be right back.